starting to get punishing gusts and a whistling sound of the wind.
Well, the 2025 hurricane season was unique, and while the U.S. escaped major impacts this year, monster record-setting storms took center stage across the Caribbean and the Atlantic. Now, joining me to talk more about this year's season is research Dr. Phil Klotzbach there and renowned hurricane hunter Josh Morgerman. Thank you guys so much for joining us. A lot to dive into here. There weren't as many hurricanes as forecasted, but the ones that did form just seemed to take off, and we ended up with 3 Category 5 hurricanes. Can you talk a little bit more about maybe why this happened?
We ended up with 13 named storms. Of those 13, 5 becoming hurricanes. And of those 5, 4 becoming major Category 3, 4, 5 hurricanes. Actually, all 4 of those became Cat 4s. And as you mentioned, 3 were Category 5s. It was the second most Category 5s on record for the Atlantic Basin, but with only 5 hurricanes. An average season has 7. Overall, the season had relatively low levels of vertical wind shear. That's a change in wind speed and direction with height in the atmosphere. The shear overall was fairly low, which is typically associated with more active hurricane seasons, since strong levels of shear tends to tear apart hurricanes. The waters across the Atlantic and also in general were fairly warm, quite a bit warmer than normal, not as warm as they were in 2023 and 2024, but still well above the long-term average. But the season also had a pronounced mid-season low, kind of like last year, where we went through kind of the climatological or average peak of the season, which is late August through mid-September. This year we had no storms. It was the first time since 1992 that we had gone through that. And then that was followed up with one of the strongest hurricanes on record in Melissa.
Right, and of course here, Josh, our hurricane hunter, you basically experienced the full brunt of this storm. What was it like? I mean, obviously insane, but give us some comparisons.
Everything was out in the Atlantic, the Gulf, and the Caribbean, nothing. And we kept saying these are basically like big gasoline tanks waiting for someone to drop a match on them. And then Melissa was that match. And boy, did it blow up. Absolutely. And I went through the inner core of this thing, brushed into the eye. And I will say, out of the 84 hurricanes I've been in, I think it takes the cake in terms of just the violent energy. And afterward, the wind damage was the most spectacular I've ever seen. Looked like tornado damage. And like many other people, I'm very anxious to see what the National Hurricane Center comes up with now that they're doing their post-analysis. They're looking at it real close now, closer than they could in real time, to really understand exactly how record-breaking this thing was.
What do you think about that, Phil? Do you think this could be something for the record books?
Yeah, I mean, certainly right now it's basically tied for the lowest pressure at landfall. So operationally, when they put it out, it was 892 millibars, which ties it with the Labor Day hurricane of 1935. So it's certainly going to be the lowest pressure, or very close to the lowest pressure, for a landfalling hurricane in the Atlantic on record.
I do want to talk about the lull that happened in the middle of the season here in 2025, and I think a lot of that was responsible for lowering those totals. We saw it in 2024 as well, and Phil, I'll ask you this question here. Is there any correlation between what happened last year and what happened in 2025? Is it just a coincidence?
Yeah, so we did a really deep dive into the drivers of the lull of last year. We actually just had a paper published on that. Kind of what was kind of driving that lull. That lull was about 5 weeks long. One of the most pronounced drivers of that lull was what we call a tropical upper tropospheric trough, which is kind of a mouthful, but it's basically a low pressure high up in the atmosphere, say 20 to 30,000 feet. When those develop, they tend to be associated with a lot of dry air. And also a lot of vertical wind shear. You get really strong winds out of the west, high up in the atmosphere. And that tends to really kind of knock down anything that's trying to develop in the eastern and especially the central Atlantic.
Right, and it seems, it's interesting because we started with a bang both years, we ended with a bang both years. What you talked about here related to the MJO, excuse me, and what about the influence of Saharan dust? How does both of these factors influence this season?
Yeah, so the Madden-Julian Oscillation, or MJO as you call it, is basically it is tropical thunderstorm activity that moves around the globe about every 30 to 70 days. And as it does so, it alters levels of vertical wind shear, similar to kind of what El Nino, La Nina does on a seasonal timescale. But Matt and Julian oscillation is on a shorter time scale. In October, I think maybe it played somewhat of a role, at least in enhancing the African easterly wave that became Hurricane Melissa. That was a very robust wave as it came off of Africa, and you could really track it very clearly all the way till it got into the Central Caribbean, where it slowed down and eventually blew up and exploded.
Gotcha. A lot of times these forecasts are predicated on the ENSO, but I know there's a lot more variables as well.
I'll say this, that, you know, it mystified folks that the U.S. didn't get any hurricanes this year. And actually, that's normal. The U.S. often goes a year or two without any hurricanes. You know, it's happened, 2015, 2013, 1982, 1981. I mean, it actually is very common. But the other thing about U.S. hurricane activity, or just hurricane activity anywhere, is that it's very cyclical and it's very up and down. And, we've had an unbelievable 8 or 9 year run of just all of these tremendous impacts in the United States, one after the other, starting around 2017. It's just been crazy. But the decade before that, we had gone the longest we'd ever gone without a major hurricane. So it's really, this is the nature of hurricanes.
I'll ask Phil one last question here. What have we learned this year, and will what happened this year and last influence our forecast for next year, and what maybe do you see for next year?
A lot of the reason why our seasonal forecasts have skill is because of vertical wind shear, our ability to forecast vertical wind shear months in advance. In general, as you've talked about, El Nino, La Nina, Atlantic water temperatures will drive levels of vertical wind shear. And so when you have less of that shear, it tends to be a busier season. So if you have a shear with low shear, but also, a lot of stability, those can be kind of hard seasons to overall forecast. So I think that's something we're going to be working on.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Really, really appreciate all your time. We'll continue to keep an eye on the tropics through the rest of the year, and we'll continue to keep you updated on all your top weather headlines here at WeatherNation.